Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello everyone, welcome to this concluding lecture of this class. In this session, what I thought was we would first summarize the highlights of the course. So we have covered several areas in project planning and control. I thought I would go through those so that we could review some of the topics we have done. I will then move on to covering some of the emerging trends and tools in project planning. I thought this would be useful, especially for those of you all are looking for project topics and want to kind of explore some new areas. Certainly we have seen there are challenges in the way CPM, PDM and these resource planning and all of these tools are used, but let's also get a flavor of what are the currently emerging tools in research and in industry. And then we have a special guest, Professor Raghavan, who will give us his perspective on planning. He's a very experienced industry professional, and we will have a brief talk by him on what he feels are the industry perspectives on planning and scheduling issues. Finally, I think most of you will be keen to discuss what the pattern of the exam will be, and I will briefly cover what is the mark allocation for the topic, so it will help you in preparing for the exam, and finally the acknowledgements in running the program. So looking at the course highlights, the topics we covered, if we go back to week 1, you'll recall we introduced what project management was. We talked about the art and science of project management, and these concepts are still very important because now when we are at the end of the course, when you look back, we really learned a lot of detailed issues. We tried to make project management or project planning and control more of a science, but you have to kind of reflect and see how much of subjectivity was still there. Are we able to make it a pure science, or are there still art issues in that? So this is something you can reflect back now, and this topic is very important because a lot of what we learn in project management, we have to understand the balance. We looked at the objectives of a project, and we discussed that with reference to these objectives, we are primarily looking at time and cost issues in this course. But certainly the other objectives such as safety, quality, the environment are also very, very important, need to be managed effectively for project success. We then looked at some of the broad issues facing the Indian construction industry, the impact it has on national growth. We talked broadly about project stakeholders, the phases of a project, and it is important for you all to understand this to put the context of where planning is in a project. And then finally we talked about scheduling levels in this course, and then in this session, and then responsibilities of a scheduling engineer. And now that you have covered several of the tasks a scheduling engineer does, I hope you have more detailed ideas on what these levels and how they fit. When we went on to week 2, we actually started on some of the basic tools. We primarily looked at time management. We looked at how time can be managed with various types of tools. We covered some simple tools, and then we primarily looked at the Gantt chart or the bar chart, which is widely used in industry. We then, but before we actually started identifying activities for the Gantt chart, we said that we had to develop a work breakdown structure or a WBS, and we actually went through kind of what should be the aspects of a WBS, how do we identify areas, activities, options, and now you will again, when you come to the end of the course, you'll realize that then you can kind of get a feel that if you don't identify the activities correctly, all the analysis is meaningless, either both for planning requirements and for control requirements. So starting with WBS is very important, and getting a proper activity breakdown is critical. We looked at certainly we then looked more details into the bar chart, and I think most of you should be very familiar with drawing a bar chart or interpreting a bar chart. We looked at historically how a bar chart was used to represent much more information than that's available today. But with the current tools, even the software or even CPM, we still go back to the bar chart to communicate information effectively. So this was what we had covered in week 2. When we went to week 3, we started with the activity duration estimation. We went into a fair amount of detail on how we estimate duration, either from given the resources, how do we estimate what is required, or based on a given duration we estimate how much resources and how much productivity is required to achieve the duration. We then went into basics of network. We introduced how a network represents a project. We primarily used the activity on node approach, and then we did basic network techniques and how we actually get results of the network which can be represented into a bar chart. When we went into week 4, we then actually went more in depth into network representation and analysis. We, in addition to the early start, early finish, late start, late finish, we talked about the floats, the various types of floats and how floats are used for decision making. We gave simple examples, which you should be familiar with, what we call the ABCD examples, and they are basically to illustrate the concept and get your basic procedure right. And then we scaled it to really a small project, but what we call the two-span bridge problem, and we applied all of these concepts to this two-span bridge problem. And judging by all the discussions that were posted on the forum on the two-span bridge, it looks like people took this up well, were able to kind of relate to the concepts, and several good questions were asked, and we hope we provided answers to these which resolved the issues. But like we said during the lecture, that the two-span bridge, we have only illustrated one way it could be done, certainly with a lot of assumptions. When you get to the field and you have to implement, there will be alternate methods, alternate ways, and it can be the network will represent generally what's happening, but need not represent in detail what is happening in the two-span bridge. When we went to week 5, we had to do, we introduced the concept of time cost trade-off, or what we call crashing. Again, we introduced the simple project, the ABCD project, and went through the steps of crashing. We went from the basic concept, we used a tabulation approach to be able to systematically do crashing, and then we also considered factors such as bonus and penalty, and basically the duration when the total cost is minimum. All these concepts were covered, and I think most of you have done problems on this well, and we got some feedback on some of the issues which were I think hopefully clarified. Week 6, we moved on to resource scheduling. So this is an important area. We covered several aspects of resource scheduling. We started with very, very basic elements as to how to load resource, how to allocate resource. We looked at the over allocation problem. We looked at cumulative resource graphs, specific weekly or specific duration resource graphs. We then talked about the over allocation issue and how over allocation can be resolved basically using floats. So these are important concepts. We then went on to resource profiling, specifically resource leveling, and we talked about leveling both from an intuitive perspective, and then we introduced the concept of minimum moment and the improvement factor in order to be able to assess if a resource histogram was at a proper position of leveling or not. And we looked at, we made this assumption that a rectangular profile is what we want, and we looked at generating this improvement factor which gave us whether there was any improvement when we shifted resources. Now we went on to week 7 then, and here we introduced the precedence diagramming method, which is available in a lot of the software, and people do tend to use it. We then looked at how the precedence diagramming method can really, unless it's represented properly, there can be issues with it. So we looked at network calculations with it, as well as problems and issues that come when we use a PDM. And we looked at some of the critical issues such as negative lags, and said how we should avoid negative lags. We looked at precedence diagramming method with just sometimes just single start or finish, and discuss the problems with that. We went on to discuss continuous duration type PDM or non-continuous duration and the issues with each type. We then went on to also discuss different types of floats which were there with the PDM. Okay, so this we talked about finish float, start float, relationship float. These are all again they are not widely discussed in practice, but they are very critical if you choose to use a PDM and all the features of a PDM to represent your project. You have to know these things in detail. In the same week we also started the concept of project monitoring, which is very important. We reviewed the BIS standard and how the processes it had for project monitoring. We then actually went to the micro level and using some examples showed how the percentage complete is what is basically required to do effective project monitoring, and how we calculate percentage complete with different methods and how each method can actually give us various answers. So this is certainly an issue which is a practical issue, because if the planning team or the execution team does not use the appropriate method, you will not be able to get a proper reflection of what is happening, the progress that is happening on the field. Okay, and then in this week we started with earned value analysis. So we extended the project monitoring and control issue to to a higher level. Now we moved from the micro plan and the macro plan to more the management level where earned value analysis is used. We looked at how percentage complete of a project can be computed, not just percentage complete of an activity but of the whole project, and how earned value analysis approach is useful for that. We then talked about the cost and schedule performance indicators. These tend to be extremely important, and today they are the means by which a project manager would actually kind of make a quick assessment of what the status of the project is. We also looked at how these earned value indicators are not only applicable at the project level but also at the work package level. We kind of looked at how forecasts can be developed based on these earned value indicators, and some of the examples illustrated how these concepts can be applied. We then went on to the topic of uncertainty in project schedules. This again is a very large area. Risk and uncertainty is a huge area in project management which is evolving, and as the tools become more sophisticated, we are really able to quantify and more scientifically manage risks in projects, construction projects. But we basically covered the PERT technique, which is historically the first strong technique which was applied from a probabilistic perspective. We looked at the backgrounds and assumptions of PERT. We found that there were several assumptions which limited the use of PERT, but still it was a very powerful technique which allowed the planning team to be able to assess and give probabilistic estimates for the project duration. Now we went through also a stepwise procedure for PERT which kind of takes you through, and we took you through an example which illustrated how we calculated various parameters from PERT. And with that we have actually come to all the topics we have kind of highlighted through this course, and we really looked at several of the discussion points raised by several of you, and they were very good points, and like I said earlier, I hope we have addressed these satisfactorily. If there are any points, do raise it, because I think the interaction on the forum has been extremely good.